We will now continue with our introduction to Menachos, and we were talking about the psul of Yotze in a case where the mincha was taken out of the Azara, and since a mincha has the status of Kodshim, it's possible b'Yotze when it leaves the Azara, as opposed to Kodshim Kala, which is b'chol ha'ir. And now we have a machlokas rishonim as to at what point is there kedushas haguf, which generates an event that was taken out of the Azara, a psul of Yotze. According to one school of thought, which we identified as Rashi, once the mincha was put into a kli shares, even before kmitza, it's already niskadesh b'kedushas haguf by virtue of the fact that it's in the kli shares, and if you take it outside the chomas hazara, it's possible midin yotze. Tosfos, on the other hand, is of the opinion that only from the moment of kmitza is there a psul of yotze. However, Tosfos writes that there are menachos like minchas kohanim and minchas nisach which don't have kmitza, and in such a case they become possible biyotze, as Rashi would have it, from the moment of kiddush kli, so that we only postpone the psul of yotze to the point of kmitza when there is kmitza. If there's no requirement of kmitza in minchas kohanim, for example, and the same is true for minchas nisachim, then Rashi is right that there's no reason to postpone and delay the kiddush of the mincha and hence the psul of yotze to a later period of time. Kiddush kli is enough because that completes the process on its own. When there's kiddush kli followed by kmitza, then we need both the combined powers of both of them integrated to form a full-fledged kiddush. And Tosfos of the opinion, before the full-fledged kiddush, there is no psul of yotze. But in a case where you could have the full-fledged kiddush of the mincha without kmitza, because there is no kmitza, then kiddush kli alone is sufficient to generate a kiddush saguf, and therefore a psul of yotze. Now, this all will impact on the status of lechem hapanim. Lechem hapanim, instead of kmitza, the avoda, the lechem hapanim, is what's called hanocha al gavei hashulchan, otherwise known as siddur shulchan. Tosfos says that in the case of lechem hapanim, from the moment of siddur shulchan, once the lechem was placed on the shulchan, that's kiddush kli. And therefore, at that particular moment, there is an avoda that took place. Once the avoda took place, obviously there's kiddush saguf, and there'll be a psul of yotze. Now, if you want to prove and demonstrate that this siddur al shulchan is itself the avoda with regard to the lechem hapanim, there's no kmitza, I'll prove it to you from the fact that the siddur al gabi shulchan is required kohen. You need a kohen. If siddur al shulchan was just a technicality, then even a zar could be mesader the lechem hapanim on the shulchan. We need a kohen, and that's because siddur al shulchan is an avoda, and at that moment of the avoda, what triggers off is the full-fledged kiddush of the guf of the lechem hapanim. Hence, if you take the lechem hapanim out of the azara, they become possible yotze. So that completes the discussion that we had yesterday about yotze, and now we go on to a new discussion about what's called mimashki Yisrael min amuta b'ficha. We'll explain as we go along, but the basic highlight or summary of that principle is that whatever is asur to achilas hejot is ipso facto asur to achilas mizbeach. The mizbeach is allergic, so to speak, and rejects anything that's asur for achila. And therefore, if you bring a mincha from something that's osir b'achila, then that mincha cannot be brought on the mizbeach because it's osir b'achila. Now, where is this famous pasuk that I quoted, Mimashki Yisrael? It's a pasuk in Yechezkel Hanavi in Perek Mem Hey, and that's a very important perek for the laws of Kodshim. And it says, "V'seh achas min atzon min amasayim, Mimashki Yisrael lemincha li'olo l'shlomim l'chapra leim." And the Chazal Darshan on Daf Vav, Mimashki Yisrael. Mimashki Yisrael means those liquids that could be imbibed, that could be drunk by a Yisrael. Those can be brought on the mizbeach, and that's called min hamutar liYisrael ba'achila mutar b'ficha. However, anything that cannot be eaten because it's machalas asuros is excluded from the mizbeach. So if you were to bring on the mizbeach a non-kosher animal, for example, or a beverage, a liquid that's not kosher, it would be possible in mizbeach. Mimashki Yisrael min hamutar b'ficha. Now, what happens in a case of something that once had a shasa kosher? For example, the whole year round, chametz is mutar b'achila. Only on Pesach it becomes osel achila. And you may recall, John, that we had a long discussion about this when we were learning chulin upstairs in the good old days in the shtibelach. We had a whole sug in chulin about hayelo shasa kosher, lo hayelo shasa kosher. Like in Kilayim, before you mix the two seeds of the two minim, it had a shasa kosher, possible cholov. The basa was mutter, the cholov was mutter. Is that called yeshel shasa kosher? And the bottom line is that even if you classified many of these machalas asuros, like Kilayim, I'm talking about Kilay Zroim, or basa b'cholov and the like, as yeshlem shasa kosher, nevertheless, they are possible in mizbeach. Min hamashka b'ficha, min hamutar b'ficha means it's got to be kosher now. The fact that it once was kosher before you mix the two, that's irrelevant. Okay, now we get to a couple of heavy issues about Mimashki Yisrael. Number one, what about kmitza? Kmitza is not eaten by the Kohen. Only the Shirayim are eaten by the Kohen. Kmitza is given to the mitzvah haktorah al gabi mizbeach. And we can classify the case of kmitza in menachos as kmitza is haktorah sheyesh ba achilas mizbeach. So he quotes in the footnote here the Zera Avram. I'm not familiar with the Sefer. And he writes that the psul of Mimashki Yisrael, that disqualification does not apply to kmitza and menachos. And why is that? Because lo nemar, this psul is only noeg the haktorah sheyesh ba'achilas mizbeach. Anochi hakatan, I don't understand what he means that kmitza is different than any haktorah that has achilas mizbeach. Unless he means no. I had a thought, but I just completely rejected it. But in any event, Yesha Kosav, thank God, at least we understand the Shita of the Karen Ora and the Chazon Ish. They disagree with the Zera Avram. It's too radical of a Kiddush. And they say that psul zeh of Mimashki Yisrael, noe gam kmitza. Kmitza requires achilas mizbeach, and we're only going to put on the mizbeach. We're only going to feed the mizbeach that which we ourselves achilas hedjod would be permissible. In the case of macholas asuros, we cannot be machsher the kmitza because it's going to go on the mizbeach with haktorah, and it's not mimashki beficha. But the sheet of the Zera Avram, that this is haktorah which doesn't have achilas mizbeach, I'm not sure what that means. Now, Rabosai, if you have the pages that I gave out, I don't have the time right now to search. We had a paragraph, I just don't remember on what page it was. Maybe you could remind me about the shear of Kmitza. Do we happen to be approximately page base, if you have the pages. Okay, I don't have it right now, so I don't want to get distracted, but I'm writing myself a mental note. I'd like to check that page that has the shiur of Haktoras HaKmitza. Or should I take a minute? You know what? Let me just take 1 minute. I don't want to keep you waiting, but I might be able to find it. Just see if I could quickly find that paragraph. Oh. Nechleku amoroim b'shi'uro shel komets. This is on page Yud Beis. I don't know where my photocopy of page Yud Beis got lost, but I have the original. L'shitas Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi v'Rava ein komets pachos mi shnei kizesim. L'das Rabbi Yochanan v'Abaye yech komets gam b'pachos v'shir zeh. Shucks. I was excited, but I don't know. What does it mean, b'pachos v'shir zeh? I assume, which is disappointing, that it means one kizayis is enough as a shear of komets. Im komatz yoser mishir kmitza, a kometz posel. And the same is true if he has less than the shear. Okay. I had an idea which I was going to get very excited about, but I think it's not necessarily correct. Okay, let's go on. Now we have another issue with regard to Isurei Achila on the Mizbech. And this is a stipler. You heard of the stipler, the Kilos Yaakov. Now, we have here a summary of the basic issue, what we call a Chakira Nishibis of the stipler, but he doesn't tell you the nafkamina. which was a little bit of a disappointing. And it's not easy to get a hold of the stipend. How do we understand the case of Mimashki Yisrael ben Amutu Befifu? When you have something that's also bachila and you put it on the mizbech, there's a classic methodological chakira called Simon or Siba. And the stipler is going to plug that in here in the case of Mimashki Yisrael. Is it a Siba, which means because it's usher to a hedgehog, therefore it's usher to Mizbeach? Oh, Shu Simon. It's not because it's also to Achilas Adam, therefore it's disqualified from the Mizbeach, but it's a din in Karbanos that if you want to know what is roy, what is suitable and qualifies for the Mizbeach, take a look at the list of that which is permissible for eating, for a hedgehog, for you and I. Davar HaKarev L'Gavoat, Sarach Lios Roy Gam L'Yisrael. So that's Simon. Simon means I look at the list of that which is royal Israel, and that list will give me the exhaustive list about what is royal Mizbeach. The other side is to say that Kol Ha'asur Lachilas Hedjot, Asur Ligavo, meaning because you can't eat it, therefore you can't put it on the Mizbeach. But as I said before, he doesn't give you enough community. I'll just give it a second of thought if we can come up with enough kivina. Perhaps you could say what I'm about to say is wrong, but maybe under certain circumstances it could be correct. That b'di'evet, if he took that which is asur to achilas adam and he used it on the mizbeach, it could be that in some sense the carbon would be kosher. You know, it's let me just give you an example, like we have in Shalol Lishma, the carbon is kosher, but it's all abayil shem chiv. You know, we have that gray area. Maybe this would come under that gray area. B'di'evet. Of course, chatchil we can't do this, but b'di'evet, if he did it, maybe there is some sort of. If on the other hand it's a simon and it's telling you what goes on the mizbeach and what does not, and you took a min ha'aser and you put it on the mizbeach, that for sure is worthless. If I hold it's not a simon but rather a siba, that means because it was aser to achilas adam, therefore it's aser to the mizbeach. Maybe you could say that b'di'evet we can recognize to some extent relative the validity of that carbon. Why? Because you're just borrowing the Isur le Adam and you're saying that's not what we should feed them as bad. I'll give you an example. In what's called mitzvah baba averim, you ate matzah's tevel, so you violated the Isur tevel. Did you fulfill the mitzvah of matzah? Do we give you credit for matzah or not? It depends on siba or simon. If we're going to say that mitzvah baba avera means that because you violated an avera, therefore we're not going to recognize your mitzvah, could be that b'di'evet, if you did the mitzvah, we can recognize the mitzvah. But if you say that it's a simon and it tells you what is matzah and what is not matzah, and matzah hasura b'din tevel is not matzah, then you don't have any credit at all, and it's not meaningful as a mitzvah. Okay. Now we get to a third issue in Mimashki Yisrael, and that's called Svichei Shvius. Now, Svichei Shvius, which is a major sugya in Masechta Shvius, and it will come up over and over again in the very near future here in Eretz Yisrael, is a machlokas between Rabbi Akiva and the Chacham. Rabbi Akiva holds that Svichei Shvius is also min haTorah. Now that's a gigantic chiddush. Why? Because when we say that Shvius is asur, I mean that's antithetical to Shvius. Shvius is Arab, is endowed with kedusha, and you have to eat Shvius. So why are you telling me that it's shvius and it's also? That's a contradiction in terms. And the answer is because it's a neva. Neva means that you violated shvius and you worked the land when you aren't allowed to do so, and you produced a crop. That crop is also minatorah. But what about svichei shvius? Svichei shvius are crops that grew without avoda. Right? There's certain natural vegetables that grow over the course of time. There's rain. So you didn't do any work whatsoever in plowing the land, in planting the land. So it's not neva. Nun ayin beis dalid. It's sfichin. Sfichin is that which grows on its own. Rabbi Akiva says that that's also min Torah. We don't know why. Pashtus is like the Chachamim, that's only also Rabbanan. We're afraid that if we allow you to eat shvius of sfichin, you might come to eat shvius of nevat, not differentiating between this crop or this vegetable and that vegetable. This one was planted, this one wasn't planted, it grew on its own. You might confuse the two, and that's Gzeira D'Rabbanan. Now, a Gzeira D'Rabbanan would not come under the psul, the exclusion of Mimashki Yisrael, because on a Doraisa level it is Mimashki Yisrael. Minatori, you're allowed to eat Spichei Shvius. But according to Rabbi Akiva, who holds that Spichei Shvius is also Minatorah, then if you brought Spichin as a korban mincha, let's say you had chitin that grew on their own, and then after Shvius you harvested this crop of wheat, and you made solas out of it, you brought it as a mincha, according to Rabbi Akiva, that should be possible in this bayah, because Spichin is also b'achilim in Torah, according to Rabbi Akiva. So the Gemara says, according to the way Tosa interprets the Gemara, no, that's not true. Even Rabbi Akiva would agree that Svichei Shvius is kosher l'mizbeach. Why? Why isn't it excluded under Mimashki Yisrael, since Rabbi Akiva holds that the Isser of Svichei Shvius is Dorais? And the answer is the following. That there are certain menachos that are chova, they're obligatory. We're not talking now about a midava, a pledge that I volunteered to bring a mincha. Now these karbonos mincha shel chova are obligatory 7 out of 7 years, meaning all 7 years, even Shemitah. So the Torah is telling me that I'm obligated to bring the korban mincha even during Shvius. So you might say, well, according to the Chachamim, let him bring Svichei Shvius, but that's not an option according to Rabbi Akiva, who holds that Svichei Shvius is also asur in Torah. The answer is what we call mitzvah. If I ever find that black marker, I'll write it on the whiteboard. And what does it mean, mitzvah? The very fact that the Torah obligated you in this mincha, year in and year out, including the Shemitah year, it means that the Torah pushed aside the principle of mimashki Yisrael ben amuta b'ficha. We override that principle for the sake of the mitzvah. Mitzvah sabakach means the Torah gave me this mitzvah in a situation of Easter, of Shvius. I mean, it's similar, again, though it's not equated, to the case of Kilayim B'tzitzis, or, for example, Big Day Kahuna. Big Day Kahuna, Avneto, possibly even of a hedgehog, but certainly of a Koy Gadol, is made with Kilayim of Pishtan and Semen. So you're going to tell me, how can I violate the Isa Kilayim? The answer is mitzvah sabakach. The Torah told you that this is the mitzvah of Big Day Kahuna. And here the Torah told you to bring the peros of Shvius as a korban mincha, in the case of Minchas Chova, even during the 7th year. So it must be mitzvah sabakach, even if you're dealing with Svichei Shvius, despite the fact that Rabbi Akiva holds Svichei Shvius is asur min Torah. Just going to close the door, sorry. Now, if you would ask me for what we call a baich svarim means it comes from the belly, not from the brain, I would have said something entirely different. Forget about mitzvah sabakach. Maybe the Torah would say that on Shvius you don't bring a korban mincha from Sfichem, which is mimashki yisrael and amutu fichetz also. I would have suggested that the Isser of Sfichei Shvius, even according to Rabbi Kiva, is not in the Chefza, it's in the Gavra. Putting on my brisker thinking cap. A Chefza di Surah, which is inherent in the object, it's also fat. Don't bring that on the Mizbeach. Bring me Mashki Yisrael. But if the object per se, the foodstuff, in and of itself, is heter gomel, on the contrary, you're talking about Shvius, but the Torah says stay away from it, that's an Isa Gavra, but it's not inherent in the Chefza, then Nafkamina would be, as far as Mimashki Yisrael, putting it on the Mizbeach. That which is also to me, but it's not inherent in the Chefza, it's not a Chefza D'Isura, that doesn't come under the purview of Mimashki Yisrael and Amutar. I mean, if I'm correct, this would have a tremendous nafkamina about Tevel. Let's say you brought a mincha from Tevel without being mafit shumas and meiser. Would that mincha be kshera because Tevel is only an Isa Gabra, not an Isa Chefza? Okay. Now, I just want to add one last point to our discussion, and that is that if you ask me for a classic example of a korban mincha that's brought on Shvius, what we call mitzvah sabakach, it would be the minchas ha'omer. The omer, which is barley, has to be brought every year, including the Shemitah year. That's mitzvah sabakach. Just very quickly to introduce the next topic, which is called Hachzoras Kometz Shenikmatz Bipsul L'Kli HaMincha. Let's say, for example, in all the cases that we gave where the Kometz is possible, like, for example, Nitma or Lina, and we had a discussion about Yotze. Now, after it became possible, he went ahead and he did kmitza. So Ben Beseira is of the opinion that he could take that kometz, put it back into the mixture, and do another kmitza. He can simply replace a second kmitza, replace the first kmitza, which was done b'psul, with a second kmitza. So let me give one example, and Belina tomorrow will get into this. Avodah has to be done by a Kohen in a standing position, not in a sitting position. The Kohen sat, and he was makriv the mincha, or let's say he did the kmitza of the mincha, or alternatively, let's say he did the kmitza with his left hand instead of his right hand. Can he now take that kmitza, mix it back into the original soles, and do another kmitza? Or do we say no? There's a permanent psul in the kmitza because you did the kmitza when you were sitting instead of standing. or you did the kmitza with your left hand instead of your right hand. In other words, do we say that these actions generate a psul in the kmitza? Really, again, in my humble opinion, it comes down to our question before, whether it's gavra or chefta. Because if the psul is chal and chefta, then what good would it do to replace it with a new kmitza? But if it's only in the gavra, you can't use it for your carbon. But if you can just revoke and reverse the kmitza by putting it back into its original mixture, do another kmitza. There's nothing inherently possible in the comments. That's just by way of introduction to what promises to be a pretty major topic. Okay, then, so we'll make a note of where we got up to, and we will open up the Gemara in Masechta Yom.